Hello, and thank you for joining me. I'm Mark Chussell, the founder of Advanced Competitive Strategies. Welcome to this ACS strategy story, a brief presentation on a single strategy subject. This time, it's how do you know your strategy is working? So far, so good, we say. Things are going according to plan, but things also go wrong. We'll see a one-word cause for things gone wrong and a one-word cure. They're not the only cause and the only cure, of course, but they do matter. So the short version of this slide is that I have researched and consulted in competitive strategy around the world for over 40 years. Here we have a real company. Out of courtesy, I will not give its name, but you have heard of this company. This chart shows the company's trend in its stock price over 15 years. Now, I'm sure you notice as you look at this chart that its stock price went down to zero and it stayed there. Yes, that means this company went bankrupt. What happened was a new competitor had entered this company's market. So my question for you is this: when did the new competitor enter the market? Now, what you might say is that the new competitor entered perhaps around year 3 or 4. Clearly, there's money to be made in this market that would attract new competition. Or perhaps it was around year 4 or 5. The stock price could go down because it had a new competitor. Perhaps around year 6 or 7, because that's when the company was evidently getting weak and vulnerable. Now, those are just stories, of course, and I have heard those stories and more when I use this case in workshops, and you may have different stories, and that's all fine. But the actual time that this new competitor entered the market was 1.5 years before the chart began. That means that the incumbent's stock price went up for years after the new competitor entered the market. For years after the new competitor entered, we could say our strategy is working. Then things start to look bad around year 4 or 5, something around there. So we cut costs to maintain our margins, or we cut our prices to boost our demand. It's not short-term orientation, it's making tough choices. We're doing exactly what we were hired to do because we were hired to make the numbers. And the irony is, we make the numbers. It looks like everything is under control. It looks like our strategy is working. We are making the numbers, but in reality, we are starving the business. By the time we realize that we're starving the business, it's too late. It didn't work. Making the numbers is just not the same thing as competing effectively. So let's take a look at the flip side. When we think it's working, when it actually is not, we suffer from a false positive, like the company that went bankrupt. The flip side is when we think it's not working, when it actually is. That's a false negative. Let's take a look here. Imagine that we're back in the 1980s. General Motors cars had many defects. You could expect 7 or 8 of them if you bought a new GM car. So GM went to work on that, and they hugely reduced the number of defects in their cars. Defects went down, quality went up, and so of course market share went down. Why did GM lose share? Some people say numbers speak for themselves. Just imagine the story those numbers are telling here. Customers liked the defects. Obviously, that's absurd, but we use exactly that reasoning when we look at trends. Now, actually, it's not necessarily absurd. So perhaps GM sacrificed competitive advantage elsewhere if it decided to focus too much on its defects. But maybe we're not listening to all the numbers that are trying to speak for themselves. What about competitors? Did GM improve less than they did? Well, here now we're looking at how things looked relative to Ford and Chrysler. GM did not lose ground relative to them. Ford and Chrysler had plenty of defects too, They went to work on their defects. Everybody ended up about the same relative to each other as when they started. But have we looked at the relevant competitors? New competitors from Japan were making major headway in the American market at the time, and the Japanese car makers had far fewer defects. But the thing is, the Americans largely closed the gap. And at some point, defects become so uncommon and defect rates become so similar that they just don't matter much when customers are making purchase decisions. And that actually has happened. So I think GM lost share simply because the Japanese brands were investing in the market. They expanded distribution, they gained positive reputations, they offered better fuel efficiency in addition to the better reliability. Reducing defects helped GM, but not as much as new competition hurt. Let's put it another way. GM would have lost more share if they had not improved defect rates. That case illustrates an important point. Here's that one word cause that I mentioned before. It is this is the word yesterday. We measure progress by seeing whether things are better today than they were yesterday. Now, I don't mean yesterday literally. I mean at some point in the relevant past. The idea is we took action yesterday and something is better or worse today. We infer cause and effect. Yesterday says reducing defects didn't work and therefore our share went down. Now, I'm overstating, but really not by very much. Now, the one word cause of trouble is yesterday. I promised you another word. That word is otherwise. The relevant analysis is not whether things are better or worse than yesterday. The relevant analysis is whether things are better or worse than they would have been otherwise. Stronger competitors meant that GM was likely or even certain to lose market share. The question is whether their share had to fall as much as it did. And by the way, it fell even more over the years. They were down to about 35% in 1989. Today, they're under about 20%. It is possible to get a good idea of what would have happened otherwise. I know it is possible because I build models to project performance in different competitive environments. That's a big subject in itself, so we're not going to deal with that today. But it is possible to do that. So how can you implement otherwise thinking and strategizing? One way is with business war games. They're perfect for otherwise because they help us to understand competitive action and reaction much better than we can with accounting-based analysis, make the numbers, or with trendline forecasts. At the end of gaming over the time horizon, the home team, that is the team that's role playing the client company, is often disappointed or even shocked to discover what their competitors can do. Now, if that were the end of the war game, we'd have a really depressed client. That's why I always make time for at least one more round. Imagine that the first round, the one that left them disappointed or shocked, imagine that the first round was just a dream. Now we've seen what could happen. Now that we've seen that, let's turn the clock back and try again. That's when the best discoveries happen. Then there's computer-based simulation. This chart shows two strategies from my top pricer tournament, which 2,000 people have entered from around the world. The tournament here simulated each of these two strategies in the same 2 million scenarios. The columns show how often each strategy performs badly, which is towards the left, or well towards the right. So we can see that strategy 1350, the green columns, performed at the highest levels of profitability almost all the time, and that's what makes it robust. You see the word robustness there. And it performs well far more often than the do nothing strategy. And that's what makes strategy 1350 better than doing nothing. Now here we see strategy 285, which is also simulated in the same 2 million scenarios. Strategy 285, the green columns, is extremely risky. It is the opposite of robust. It might perform better than the do nothing strategy, but it is more likely to perform much worse. There's strategy 1350 again from the prior slide. We can instantly see that it is far superior to strategy 285 on profitability. Much, much lower risk, much higher odds of performing very well on profitability. By the way, the two people who entered those two strategies in the tournament both thought they had the best strategies. That's why they chose those strategies. And yet, even in a relatively simple problem like the Top Riser tournament, we see wide variations in performance for strategies. Finally, the most important thing for implementing otherwise, just ask. Ask what would happen otherwise. Talk about it with your colleagues. Talk about it when you're making a strategy decision. And remember this, there is always an otherwise. And that's the end, or not entirely. So please contact me for solutions to many strategy problems. I love talking about this stuff, and it's fun, it's interesting, and I hope to hear from you. Thank you very much for joining me here.